Chapter 40. A pleasant sight. Daniel had never valued proper breathing as much as in that moment when he guided Edith's hand around him. "Breathe, don't lose your balance," he told himself, amazed that his body, so often treacherous, responded with an almost fierce joy. She hadn't looked at his twisted hip, his fickle knee, or the scars that told of old battles. She was too absorbed in watching him, not his flaws but his desire, and that certainty rose in his chest like a nearly painful surge of gratitude. He showed her how to move, accepting that the exhilaration was worth the heat climbing up his back from standing too long. "You're getting hard," Edith said, a mixture of awe and genuine attention in her voice. "Doesn't it hurt?" "Not at all," he replied without lying. "As long as it's you, everything is worth it," he thought. "Let's lie down," she suggested. "You'll be more comfortable." Daniel gave thanks once again for this woman who saw his limits without turning them into boundaries. That strengthened his resolve to be patient, to bring her pleasure without taking anything by force. "It won't be a conquest," he promised himself. "It will be an encounter. There's only one drawback," he added with a crooked smile. "I'm naked, and you're not." Edith's brown eyes widened. "I was too busy admiring your magnificent." She stopped, blushing, and slipped the overskirt over her head. "Help me undress." Her mind, still schooled in propriety, could not find a decent word to name what she wanted without shame. "I'll have to sit," he grunted, aroused by her frankness and annoyed with himself for no longer being able to fight the inevitable. She kissed his battered nose with a tenderness that disarmed him, then knelt behind him as he sat on the edge of the mattress. Daniel quickly undid the laces, pushed aside the bodice, and cupped the fullness that emerged from the corset. Edith let her head fall back against him, a soft surprised sound escaping her lips when he carefully brushed her taut nipples. "I need to get out of this dress," she exclaimed, using it for support as she lifted herself. Daniel swallowed hard. The vision revealed as Edith dropped the fabric and turned to him left him speechless. "This is how you look at me," he thought, as if there's nothing to hide. Edith felt beautiful, desirable, wrapped in the delicacy of her lingerie, the lace garters, the silk stockings, the embroidered corset. She offered a silent prayer of thanks to Madame Delacroix. Detestable woman, and yet miraculous. So this is what she meant, she thought, noticing how the rigid edges of the corset teased her nipples, still sensitive from Daniel's touch. Her husband watched her with an almost reverent awe. "Do you like it?" she asked, needing to hear it. "Like it," he replied, his voice breaking. "The corset," she clarified. "I don't usually wear them, but—" She couldn't finish. Daniel lunged toward her, wrapping his arms around her waist and taking one breast into his mouth. "Magnificent," he murmured. They fell together onto the bed. Desire ignited in his belly as he felt the brush of her teeth, the rhythmic pressure of her body against his. "I shouldn't feel this," he thought fleetingly, and the thought dissolved the moment he settled her at his side and spoke with an intimacy that made her shiver. "Now I want to taste you." He undressed her carefully, knelt between her legs, and held her as if she were not a conquest but a gift. Then Edith understood. There was no shame. The pleasure, patient and skilled, swept away any thought not rooted in the present. She buried her fingers in Daniel's dark curls, recognizing that inevitable assent she had felt before, but now promising something vaster, deeper. When climax took her, she spoke his name like a repeated truth, over and over, until the world shrank to that certainty alone. Daniel knew this was the decisive moment. And yet he hesitated. He didn't want to hurt her, didn't want their union to come at the cost of a wound. "Please," Edith whispered, looking at him without fear. Without further delay, he joined her. He covered her cry with a kiss, wanting to absorb any discomfort, to share it. The urge to move was almost unbearable, but he restrained himself, holding on with effort as his breath quickened. Gradually, she relaxed. Her body began to respond. "Oh," she moaned. "I feel you inside me." Daniel smiled with a tenderness that contradicted his intensity. "She already receives me," he thought, marveling. "Do you like it?" It's wonderful, she replied, and her hips found the rhythm without any instruction. Holding back beyond reason, he waited until he felt her teetering on the edge again. Come with me, he asked. When he spilled into her, the world opened in complete silence. Afterwards he floated without a single thought, until he noticed fingers tracing slow circles over his damp back. He had fallen upon her. I'm too heavy, he murmured. I can't move. I bear your weight gladly, Edith answered. But you've demanded so much of your body. Let me help you. No, he said, surprised at the absence of pain. I just want to stay like this. Inside you. As long as we are granted. And for the first time in years, Daniel didn't feel that his body was an enemy, but a shared home. Chapter 41. Formal apologies. When Edith and Daniel arrived at the breakfast table, the valet Henry informed them that the Marquess and the Duchess's sisters had already eaten and gone for a walk in the park. Lady Agatha remained in bed. I'm glad we can have breakfast alone, Edith confessed as she helped herself to the warm dishes. A gentle serenity still lingered in her body, one that hadn't come from sleep. Daniel watched her sit across from him. This is how someone looks who has chosen, he thought, a mix of pride and still new emotion stirring in him. Are you afraid they'll notice the change in you? He asked, half smiling. What change? She replied, though she knew exactly what he meant. No one spent most of the night making love to their husband, without some trace showing on their face. You seem satisfied. Edith drew a deep breath, recalling the abandonment, and with it, the desire to climb those heights again without any shame. I've married an insatiable man, she said, amused. Be careful, he warned. Or that insatiable man might carry you up the stairs and make you forget the rest of the day. Promises, only promises, she joked as she placed the napkin on his lap. They ate in companionable silence, grateful to the new servant for the hot coffee. Edith was surprised to perceive her husband's mood so clearly. Intimacy, she thought, doesn't just align bodies, it sharpens minds too. Do you think we've conceived a child? She asked suddenly. Daniel looked up, surprised and pleased. I was thinking the same thing. Certainly you can't say we haven't tried. She gave him a small tap on the arm. I know you need an heir as soon as possible, and I would love to give you one. But I also want to have you all to myself for a while. Freedom before obligation, Daniel thought, admiring her even more. You will be an extraordinary mother, he replied. And I understand. Let nature decide. The urgency isn't the same, now that Percy can inherit nothing. I don't know the law well, she admitted. Will he lose all rights to the dukedom? Arson is a capital crime, Daniel said coldly. When they catch him, they'll hang him. And a hanged man cannot be a duke. Edith considered Crowhurst's disappearance when Edward appeared, almost running. Well, I found you. Get ready, the Baron of Thornbridge and his daughter have just arrived. Daniel cursed softly. They never come unless they want something. Try not to get angry, Edith advised. Agnes is in a terrible situation. Perhaps the Holloways knew nothing of the fire, or Percy's role. I feel sorry for her, he admitted. But it's not my fault she's pregnant. I'm tempted to throw them out. Let's hear what they have to say, she replied. Maybe if they see we're really married. She's right, Edward interjected. They can't hurt you anymore. Very well, Daniel conceded. Ask Mrs. Fitzallen to bring them into the parlor. When Edward left, Daniel added in a low voice. I'd prefer to see them alone. And I think we should face them together, Edith answered without hesitation. Not wanting to start an argument on their first day as husband and wife, Daniel offered her his arm. Despite what awaited them, he walked with deep satisfaction. He was not alone. The Baron's defeated demeanor brought an unexpected relief. Agnes sat on the sofa hunched, eyes downcast, a crumpled handkerchief in her hands. Your Grace, the Baron began stiffly. My daughter and I have come to offer our sincerest apologies for the trouble caused. Daniel exchanged a glance with Edith. I didn't expect this, she thought. It's unexpected, but we accept your apologies, he responded. May I ask? My daughter was engaged by Mr. Percy Crowhurst, the Baron said harshly. And she is with child by him. He paused, embarrassed, glaring at the young woman. I knew nothing until she confessed. Percy told her he was leaving for France and could not take a wife or child. When did he tell you? Daniel asked. The day before yesterday, Agnes whispered. He has friends in Paris and a house there. Then he knew they were looking for him, Edith said gently. Looking for him? The Baron repeated, alarmed. My cousin is responsible for a fire that destroyed my wife's family home, Daniel explained. And we have reason to believe he tried to have me killed at Waterloo. The Baron's face turned ashen. A criminal and a murderer, he spat. His child will never cross my threshold. From this moment, you are not welcome at Thornbridge, Agnes. And he left, leaving his daughter frozen, pale as a shadow. Edith could not justify the harm Agnes had caused Daniel. But she knew all too well how fragile the fate of a lone pregnant woman could be. He will change his mind, she said, sitting beside her. He won't, Agnes sobbed. He's too proud. In fact, I was surprised he didn't disown me as soon as he found out. Still, the child is his grandson. He always wanted a boy. He was never an affectionate father. You can stay here, Edith said, wishing Daniel would understand. When she looked at him, she saw the surprise on his face. At least until we find a solution. My sisters and I work with the Women's League. We help women in situations like yours. I swear I knew nothing of Percy's crimes, Agnes said. I can't believe you want to help me. It won't be easy, Daniel warned. You tried to make me the father of a child that isn't mine. I am deeply ashamed, she whispered. I trusted Percy. You were in love, Edith said gently. Love sometimes blinds us to what we don't want to see. Daniel watched his wife. There's her strength, he thought. Not in indulgence, but in the conscious choice of compassion. Chapter 42. Flaws. Daniel had mixed feelings about taking Agnes under his roof, so he left the arrangements to Edith and the household staff. Edward, not without reluctance, agreed to accompany her to Thornbridge to collect her belongings with the help of 2 valets. They had not returned when Daniel and his wife sat down to dinner. At least we can have dinner alone for the first time, he said, and even to his own ears it sounded selfish. He hurried to justify himself. It's not that I mind sharing the table with your family, but they've already eaten. Edith took his hand. It's not selfish, it's fatigue, she thought, and also a legitimate need for intimacy. It was terribly presumptuous of me to offer our protection, she admitted. Your father's rejection hurt you deeply 3 years ago, and after what happened. I don't blame you if you feel wounded. I'm not angry, Daniel replied, surprised by his own honesty. He liked being transparent with her. With Edith he needed no defenses. I admire your impulse to help those who are vulnerable. In fact, I was planning to make a considerable donation to your organization. As a wedding gift. The idea had just occurred to him, but it felt perfect. A way to honor what we are now, he thought. Oh, Daniel, she murmured, bringing his hand to her lips. That's a beautiful gesture. I will treasure it always. As they began their soup, he added, I've told Edward about Percy's flight to France. He found it curious that Crowhurst has a house and connections in Paris. Do you think he could be the French spy? Edith asked. Edward thought the same. He's going to investigate further. I'll tell Judith. She'll want to know. Daniel lowered his voice, a new weight pressing on his chest. I'm worried about what might happen to them, he said. It's clear they care for each other. We'll have to hope for the best, she replied. Judith can be very stubborn when she sets her mind to something. I hope they get their chance too, he said. Edward deserves to be happy. And if love was able to find a man like me. Edith froze at that last phrase. What do you mean by a man like you? Daniel clenched his jaw. You told Agnes that love blinds people to flaws, he answered. I have many, and yet you say you love me. Her appetite vanished, even though the soup was still steaming. Only you see your scars as flaws, she said firmly. Some look at them with discomfort, others see in them the sacrifice of war. And there are those who share your outrage at the harm caused by a cruel relative. And you? He asked quietly, finally raising his gaze. This matters more than anything else, Edith realized. Why is it so hard for you to believe I love you, Daniel? He shrugged, wounded. What is there in me that deserves to be loved? She let the napkin fall onto the table. Now you're really making me angry, she said. Do you think I would give my body and my heart to a coward, or an empty man? I want to help you ease the burden of your injuries, yes, but that doesn't mean I find you repulsive. I don't see your scars when I look at you. I see a brave, generous, noble man. Tears slid from Daniel's healthy eye as he squeezed her hand. How did I manage to win a woman like you? Edith's anger melted immediately. Well, she replied with a mischievous smile, it helps a lot that you're extraordinarily attractive in the bedroom. Really, he asked, his deep voice tracing her chest. I desired you from the first moment, she confessed, despite your proud aristocratic air. Finish the soup, he said with a smile full of promise. I think we should retire early. Impatient to take his wife to bed, Daniel barely touched a bite. They had just finished dessert, when Fitzalan announced the return of the Marquess and Lady Agnes. Frustration nearly overcame him, but he calmed at the sight of Edith's disappointed expression. We have a whole life ahead, he reminded himself, and I won't waste it. Fortunately, Mrs. Fitzalan took care of escorting Agnes to her room, avoiding an unnecessary encounter. Edward returned, visibly exhausted. Daniel poured him a brandy, and asked for something to eat. It was a trial, Edward said as he sat down. Do you mind if I loosen my tie, Your Grace? If you call me that, I'll strangle you with that tie, Edith replied. Edith, please. And I'd be honored if you called me Edward, he answered, loosening his collar. Thank heaven you didn't marry into that family, he added, turning to Daniel. Thornbridge is even stiffer and more proud than my father, and that's saying something. Daniel asked the question that wouldn't leave his mind. Do you think he knew about the pregnancy before all this? He might have suspected, Edward replied. But did he let her collect her things? Edith interjected. Clothes and a few keepsakes. He sent his maid to help her. He wanted her out of the house as soon as possible. At least that settles one matter, Daniel said. The maid can look after her. And who will pay her wages? Edith asked. If it makes her stay here easier, Daniel said without hesitation, I'll take care of it. Not out of guilt, he thought, looking at his wife, but because now we own our choices. Chapter 43. A formidable idea. I've had a brilliant idea, Edith said, sliding naked under the sheets beside her husband. Daniel watched her with that mix of desire and awe that still disarmed him. Even now, married to her, he could hardly believe that her body and will belonged to him so freely. Me too, he replied, leaning in to trace a nipple with his tongue. Wait a moment and listen to me, she said, shifting just enough to make it easier for him, though her own voice betrayed that her self-control was beginning to crack. Daniel forced himself to take a deep breath. Impatience coursed through him, reminding him of how much he wanted her and how easy it was to get lost in her. All right, he yielded, but you'll have to calm my impatience while you explain your plan. Edith settled beside him, circling him with her hand, still surprised by the frankness with which he named desire. That intimacy, she thought, was also a form of shared freedom. Is that what you men call it? She asked, smiling half modesty, half challenge. Daniel chuckled through his teeth. Perhaps not a word fit for a duchess. And you have the audacity to suggest corrections while teasing me like this, she replied.
Now you've completely distracted me.
I like distracting you, he said, kissing her again, aware that in this game there was more than pleasure, the certainty of being desired as he was with his marked body and past in tow. The idea faded quickly under the surge of desire. Edith surrendered to the sensations, to the expert way Daniel already knew her, and when he pulled away for a moment, she protested in a broken whisper.
Not yet, he murmured, struggling against his own impulse. Let it last.
She laughed, trembling, enjoying even that weight that intensified everything. Judging by your state, it doesn't seem like you need much more preparation. Impatient, he replied affectionately.
You'll thank me later.
And when he finally returned to her, pleasure swept them away without reserve. Daniel entered her with a determination that made her moan his name, and Edith received him without fear, aware that in that act old wounds were also healing. His cry, free and unguarded, filled her with a deep emotion. Not only did she desire him, she had chosen him. You were right, she managed to murmur as he collapsed onto her body, exhausted and satisfied. As their breathing slowed, Daniel tried to lift himself. I'm too heavy. I like feeling you like this, Edith said, holding him back.
It reminds me that you're here.
He smiled, with that vulnerability only she could see. Earlier, what did you say?
That I was right.
Don't be insufferable, she teased.
Now you're the one acting like a spoiled aristocrat.
I remind you that you are one too, he replied. Edith paused for a moment.
I still can't believe it.
Edith Whitcombe, Duchess of Montford. Edith Ashcroft, he corrected softly, pride threading his voice. My wife. Daniel loved that they could laugh together. It was an unexpected relief after years of rigidity and distrust. And now she added, sitting up, my brilliant idea. It has to do with your proposal to make a donation. He listened, though his attention wrestled with the recent memory of her body. Well, what if you bought or rented a house? Not just for Agnes but for women like her. A place where they're not alone. Daniel considered the idea seriously. It not only solved an immediate problem, but also aligned with the generosity he had recognized in Edith from the beginning. It's feasible, he admitted, but the name must be chosen carefully.
You're right, she agreed. It shouldn't become a mark of shame.
How about the House of Constance and Rupert, he suggested, thinking of the innocent children who also needed protection. Edith's face lit up. Perfect. She leaned toward him with a mischievous smile. Allow me to thank you properly, Your Grace. Daniel closed his eyes, aware that his body was reacting with renewed enthusiasm. Perfect, he murmured, knowing the word fell short. The next morning, Edith felt relieved to learn that Agnes had requested breakfast in her room. Any contact between her and Daniel would have only reopened old wounds. The plan was set. Edith would present the project to the League, and Daniel would instruct his estate manager to look for a suitable property. When Edith knocked on Agnes's door, a maid eyed her warily before stepping aside. Agnes appeared wrapped in a light robe, her pregnancy already visible. Edith was grateful that Daniel wasn't there. She knew how much the consequences of Percy's betrayal disgusted him. Good morning, she greeted, keeping her irritation in check.
The breakfast was cold, Agnes complained, sinking back onto the bed.
Edith realized she was facing someone who still hadn't accepted the seriousness of her situation. Your Grace is arranging a solution for you.
I thought I would stay here.
Edith decided not to skirt the issue.
That's not possible.
There will be a house, shared with other women in similar circumstances. Share? Agnes protested. Absolutely not. Think of the child, Edith replied firmly. The alternative is to manage on your own. Agnes's resistance collapsed suddenly, tears streamed uncontrollably.
I don't care about the child.
Everything would be easier without him. Edith saw not cruelty in those words but despair. She sat beside her and took her hand. You don't see it now, but there will be another life for you. For both of you. I will accept, Agnes said at last, on 2 conditions.
Tell me. That my maid Emily comes with me.
Of course. And that I take charge of the other women. Edith understood that arguing would be pointless. Perhaps that responsibility would force her to grow. Agreed, she accepted. As she left the room, she thought that freedom, like love, was rarely simple, but always worth the effort. Chapter 44. The Art of Peace. Daniel laughed out loud when Edith burst into the study, recounting her encounter with Agnes with more irony than indignation. As he laughed, something loosened inside him, the relief of being accompanied, the almost childlike gratitude of having escaped, thanks to her, from an impossible coexistence. Choosing you was saving me, he thought, not daring to say it aloud. Marrying you has freed me from a fate worse than death, he finally said, aiming for lightness, though the truth weighed heavier than he pretended. And never forget it, Edith replied with a wide, lively smile. Now, Your Grace, it's time for exercises.
Yes, Miss Whitcombe, he answered, moving the blanket from his bare feet.
Although I was hoping we'd start with a massage today. Edith raised an eyebrow, amused. With her, Daniel allowed himself that mix of boldness and vulnerability he never showed anyone else. We'll start with a massage, she conceded, but I need you to stay still. And to trust. The word touched something sensitive.
Trust didn't come naturally. He had learned to resist, not to surrender.
Yet he did not protest. Edith seated herself in front of him, and began with his feet, pressing with her thumbs in a slow, almost hypnotic rhythm. Unconsciously, Daniel let his shoulders loosen. So this is what letting your guard down feels like, he thought, surprised at how easily she made it happen. You're carrying more weight than necessary, Edith murmured.
Not just in your legs.
He smiled without opening his eyes. She always sees more than I say, he thought, a mix of modesty and relief. When Daniel's body had yielded to calm, Edith rose and positioned herself behind him. She placed her fingers on either side of his face, taking special care with the weary eye, that eyelid that tended to droop when exhaustion or memories prevailed. Daniel held his breath. Not from pain but from an old resistance. Letting someone touch there meant accepting that there was a wound that could not be healed by willpower. It's okay, he told himself, letting himself be. Edith's fingers worked slowly, firm yet gentle, tracing the curve of the bone, lifting the eyelid just slightly with minimal, almost imperceptible movements. It sees, he whispered.
It's just tired.
Like you. He exhaled slowly. I am not broken, he thought, clinging to the idea like a lifeline. When you do that, he murmured, the world becomes clearer. Because not everything is fixed by pushing, Edith replied.
Sometimes you have to invite the body to return.
She continued downward to his cheekbones, pausing at the slight irregularity of the bridge. Her hands did not judge, they learned. Daniel rested his head against her without asking. The gesture was intimate, almost involuntary. Here I can rest, he thought, surprised by the certainty. I notice you're better, she said after a moment. More present. Because with you, I don't have to prove anything, he replied before thinking.
Not even strength.
Edith rested her chin on the crown of his head, still massaging.
That's also taking care of yourself, she said.
Allowing yourself to be held. Daniel closed his eyes. For the first time in a long while, fatigue did not hurt, it dissolved. And he understood, with serene clarity, that it wasn't about fixing what the past had twisted, but learning to inhabit the body without fear. Don't change this, he murmured.
What you do?
Edith smiled, unseen by him.
I don't intend to.
And in that shared silence, Daniel knew that improving didn't always mean fully healing, but feeling accompanied as the world, little by little, came back into focus. Knowing Edward would be leaving soon, Daniel called him to his study before lunch. As he spoke, he hesitated. Part of him wanted nothing to change, wanted the fragile balance he had found with Edith to remain undisturbed by irrevocable decisions. I'm better this way, he told himself, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it. Before you go, he began, resting a hand on the desk, Tell me again about those new methods you mentioned. The ones they're starting to use now. Edward studied him with professional attention, yet also with the closeness of a friend who had learned to read his silences. Edith has encouraged you, he said without reproach. It shows.
Not exactly, Daniel replied. She doesn't mind how I am.
Or how I look. But she insists that I deserve to feel comfortable in my own body. And that is harder to argue. Edward smiled gently.
She's right about that.
Daniel looked toward the window. It's not vanity, he thought, as if he needed to justify himself even to himself.
Tell me the truth, he asked. Have I left it too long?
No, Edward answered without hesitation. On the contrary. Now we understand better how to work with the body, without forcing it. There are doctors in Richmond, serious people who use subtle progressive corrections. Nothing unnecessarily heroic. Long interventions? Daniel asked, his tension plain. No, Edward denied. In many cases it's about adjustments, helping the tissue regain balance. Sometimes guiding the process is enough. He looked at him frankly. And you can always stop if you don't feel ready. Daniel rested his fingers on the wood, tapping lightly. And if I can't do it? The question never left his lips. No one will demand anything from you, Edward added.
Not even you should. That's the hardest part, Daniel admitted.
Stopping myself from demanding too much. There was a brief silence. Then Edward spoke in a reflective, almost clinical tone. We've learned a lot since the war. Even small nasal deformities like yours can be eased with less aggressive methods. Sometimes it's not about changing the face but restoring harmony. Daniel nodded slowly. Harmony, he repeated to himself. The word felt less threatening than correction. I'm not in a hurry, he said finally. I just wanted to know there are options. That I'm not doomed to stay where I am. You're not, Edward replied. And whenever you want, we'll talk about it calmly. As doctors. As friends. Daniel lifted his gaze and offered a brief, sincere smile. Thank you, he said. For not pushing me. And for being there. Edward inclined his head, accepting both the gratitude and the trust. And Daniel realized that for the first time, thinking about the future didn't fill him with dread, but with a cautious yet real sense of relief. Edith entered the room, while Benedict adjusted her husband's tie. She looked at Daniel with a mix of pride and tenderness. It still surprised her that this man, so wounded, trusted her without reservation. I know you're used to being helped with dressing, she said. I'll have to get used to it. We didn't make such a ceremony for dinner at the cottage, he replied. Except my mother, she answered. Daniel dismissed the valet and took Edith's hand, inviting her to sit. His gesture was serious. Something important, she sensed. I want to talk to you before we go downstairs. What is it? I've decided to go ahead with the reconstruction of my eyelid. Edith showed no surprise, she just held his gaze. I will support any decision you make. There's something else, he added. Edward mentioned possible surgery for my nose. What do you think? She saw in his eyes the insecure desire to be accepted. I think Edward meddles too much, she said softly, and that I love you just as you are. Daniel intertwined his fingers with hers. Silence stretched, Edith knew he was gathering courage. Finally, he spoke with raw honesty. I don't want our children to remember their father as a monster. Edith squeezed his hand. In that moment, she understood it wasn't vanity but dignity, and that love also meant standing by someone when they chose to confront their fears. Chapter 45. To comfort the spirit. Edward returned 2 days later with concrete news about the preparations for the eyelid reconstruction. Daniel and Edith received him in the study. Edith, who had already learned to read the slightest tensions on her husband's face, asked with apparent lightness, though inside she held her breath. Is the appointment in a week? Only if my friend wishes to go ahead, Edward replied, looking at Daniel. Daniel nodded. Don't bury your head, he repeated to himself, tired of running.
Yes.
Thank you for everything you've done. It's time to stop pretending bravery and take advantage of what modern science offers. Excellent! Edward exclaimed.
And since we're at it,
I've looked further into nasal reconstruction. I took some notes, in case you're interested. It can't hurt to listen, Daniel said, though he felt his stomach tighten. The fear hadn't disappeared, he had only learned to walk with it. Edward opened a notebook. Gaspare Tagliacozzi perfected the so-called Italian method, he read. He described in detail techniques that had already been practiced in Sicily since the 15th century. So they've been fixing noses for centuries? Daniel asked with a defensive irony. Much earlier, Edward went on. In India they had been practiced for centuries, because nasal mutilation was a common punishment. Edith shuddered and raised a hand to her face. Human cruelty always finds its rituals, she thought.
How horrible.
In Italy it became popular because of jewels, Edward continued. Skin from the arm was used, but the method fell out of use, weeks immobilized and strong religious opposition. It was forgotten, until a German surgeon revived it at the beginning of this century. I'm not going to Germany, Daniel cut in too quickly.
You don't have to.
Augustus Linton, an English surgeon at the Duke of Richmond's hospital in Chelsea, performed the first nasal reconstruction in England in 1816. His patient was an officer who had lost his nose due to mercury treatments. With the Italian method? Daniel asked. No. With an Indian one, using skin from the forehead. 2 years ago he published an account of 2 successful operations for restoring a lost nose. Restoring a lost nose? Edith murmured nervously. As if someone had simply misplaced it. Daniel let out a brief laugh. He understood that lightness was only fear disguised as humor. She's afraid for me, he thought with gratitude. Linton's method is far more bearable, Edward added. The first operation lasts barely half an hour. Edith fell silent. She knew that decision could not be made for him. She had said that her children would love him just as he was. Still, Daniel remembered his own childhood and the weight of another's gaze. Edward looked up from the notebook. Perhaps it helps to remember a phrase by Tagliacozzi, we restore and reconstruct the parts that nature gave and fortune took away, not so much to please the eye as to comfort the spirit and relieve the minds of the afflicted. Those words struck Daniel with an uncomfortable truth. It isn't vanity, he understood. It's dignity.
How do we contact Linton, he asked.
I'll take care of it, Edward replied. During lunch, Edith was surprised to see Daniel so serene. He spoke with Edward about timelines and preparations, as if fear were already behind him. It hasn't disappeared, she knew, he has simply decided not to obey it. Judith listened, enthralled, Dorothy seemed absent, and Lady Agatha sighed with impatience. We're boring the ladies, Edward said. Not at all, Judith replied, at the same time Lady Agatha pronounced. On the contrary, gentlemen. Dorothy blushed. Perhaps we should talk about the reconstruction of the cottage, Daniel suggested. Is that really necessary? Lady Agatha asked hopefully. We're very comfortable here. Daniel cleared his throat. Edith admired his patience. She knew how difficult it was for him to deliver bad news. I'm afraid so. The estimates have gone up. After the war, materials are more expensive and labor is scarce. So we'll have to stay here for years. His mother said, almost delighted. At least 12 months, Daniel replied without enthusiasm. Edith felt an utterly unducal urge to strangle her mother. Our first year, she thought, deserves space. Edward intervened. If I may offer a suggestion. The house where your mother spent her widowhood is empty. It's a good property, the Whitcombe ladies could settle there after a thorough cleaning. The Dower House. Lady Agatha exclaimed.
It makes perfect sense.
After all, I am the mother of a duchess. Edith was about to offer to do the cleaning herself, but then she remembered who she was now. She looked at Daniel with a silent message, heavy with plea and complicity. "Do you think it's feasible?" she asked. Daniel smiled. "I've always known how to read your silences," he thought. "Perfectly feasible." Chapter 46. When peace arrives. The fire burned low, reduced to embers. Daniel held a glass of wine without drinking from it. Edith sat beside him, legs drawn up, her expression calm. Outside, the wind barely stirred the trees. Nothing urgent. Nothing to defend. "Sometimes," she said at last, "I think I don't know what the future will be like. And strangely enough, that no longer unsettles me." Daniel glanced at her. He had learned to recognize those moments when Edith spoke from a deeper place, not solemn, but true. He did not interrupt. "I've let go of things I thought indispensable," she went on. "Ideas, certainties, even versions of myself. Some left with disappointment, others with a clean kind of sadness." But she breathed in. "By letting them go, something more honest has begun to take shape." This isn't resignation, Daniel thought. It's courage without armor.
"And what's left?" he asked softly.
Edith rested her hand over his. "Peace. Not perfect. Not constant. But real. And something unexpectedly sweet, as if there was something sacred in accepting that not everything has to be won." Daniel lowered his head. He too had let go of battles. Some by force. Others through exhaustion. He knew well that release did not always come without loss. "This year," she continued, "forced me to look at my own judgments. Things I didn't understand before, that I rejected, people even. And in looking at them straight on, something broke inside me."
"What?" he asked.
"The idea of being separate. That each of us lives on our own island." Edith lifted her gaze to the fire. "It isn't true. Nothing we do remains isolated. Everything reaches others, one way or another. For good or for harm." Daniel thought of his own reactions, of how readily the body demanded defense, attack, retreat. The body remembers before reason, he thought. "I suppose," he said, "that makes every choice dangerous." "And profoundly responsible," she replied. "Because what we feed grows. If we nourish fear, anger, separation, that spreads. But if we tend love, creativity, truth, that does too." She turned toward him, her seriousness gentle. "Nothing is stronger than love. But it asks something uncomfortable, choosing it even when we don't do it well." Daniel set the glass aside.
"Has it been hard for you?"
he asked. Edith smiled, without irony. "Very. I've failed more than once. I've said things I didn't want to say. I've reacted when I wanted to stay silent. But I've learned to choose peace, again and again. In this house. In my family. In my decisions. In me," she added silently. "Is that why you closed that chapter?" Daniel asked, finally understanding.
"Your work."
She nodded.
"I wasn't running away.
I was choosing peace and truth, without needing to defend myself." Daniel watched her with a mixture of admiration and recognition. He knew she was not speaking from superiority, but from daily imperfect practice. "When we're wounded," she said almost to herself, "the body wants to react. To defend itself. To attack, if necessary. I don't condemn it. Anger appears because something hurts." She held his gaze. "But my practice now is different, to stop. To listen. To choose peace even when it's hard. Especially then." Daniel thought of a simple, brutal truth: wounded people wound others. Not out of malice, but out of ignorance of their own pain. "Perhaps," he said, "that's the only thing we can do entirely right, not pass the wound on intact to the next person." Edith rested her forehead against his shoulder.
"That's enough."
The fire crackled softly. There were no promises about tomorrow, no guarantees. Only that silent agreement, to keep choosing peace, not as surrender but as an act of courage. And for the first time in a long while, Daniel felt that the future did not need to be conquered. It was enough to inhabit it. The fire breathed slowly, reduced to embers. Daniel set the glass aside and without a word, drew Edith toward him. It was not an urgent gesture, but a certain one, as if the body had decided before language. She let herself be carried. Here, she thought, I don't have to hold anything together. The warmth of Daniel's chest reached her before the embrace, and then his arms steady, wrapping her in a protection that did not suffocate. He rested his cheek against her hair, breathing in her familiar scent, grateful. Stay here. Don't leave entirely, he told himself, without knowing why.
Come, he murmured.
They lay down together, on the rug before the hearth. The floor was warm, the silence comfortable. Edith lay on her side, leaning against him, and traced her fingers along his shirt, following a seam as if she could set the world in order that way. Daniel held her by the waist, with a broad hand, anchoring her without possession. She lifted her face and kissed him softly, barely a brush, more a promise than an act. A kiss that said, I see you. Daniel answered without haste, closing his eyes, allowing himself to feel without policing the gesture. There's nothing to prove, he thought. Just to be. The second kiss went deeper. Edith rested her palm on his chest, feeling the beat of his heart, and let her mouth linger a little longer. There was no urgency, no demand, only a mutual recognition, you are still my home. Daniel slid his hand to the nape of her neck, and drew her closer with care. The kiss deepened, slow, filled with a tenderness that was almost painful. He felt something inside him loosen, a long-standing vigilance, a learned defense, and he let it fall away. Choosing peace is this too, he understood. Trusting one's own body. Edith parted her lips slightly, and rested her forehead against his. Thank you, she whispered, without explaining why. Daniel smiled against her skin.
For staying, he replied.
The fire crackled, complicit. Outside the night remained night, with all that was still unresolved. But there, lying together, they chose not to fight the moment. They chose love as one chooses peace, not once but every time. And that, they both thought, each in their own way, was more than enough. Epilogue. 1 year later. I can't allow a woman in your condition to walk all the way to the house, Daniel declared, with that firmness he sometimes used to hide his fear. It's a quarter of a mile, Edith shot back defiant. And if the road can take a carriage, it can take a woman in my condition. Daniel opened his mouth to insist, but she stepped in first, looking at him with a calm that allowed no condescension. I am not fragile, Edith thought, weary of being treated like porcelain. You once told me you hated it when people walked on eggshells around you.
That's exactly what you've been doing with me for months.
As if I might break at any moment. Daniel turned to Edward, searching for an ally. Protect her, he told himself. If anything happens, I'll never forgive myself. Can't you convince my obstinate wife to take the gig? Leave me out of this, Edward replied with a shrug. Apparently, walking is healthy for pregnant women. Traitor, Daniel muttered. Edward smiled. And this time, what's your mother-in-law's excuse for throwing a party? Officially, she's honoring a cousin for St. Bartholomew. Unofficially, she'd do it, even if there weren't a saint in sight, Daniel replied.
The cousin, by the way, declined the invitation.
And there's still a party? Of course. I think she's even pleased. I suspect he wouldn't fit well with the collection of respectable gentlemen she's been trying to cultivate since she moved there. Any excuse will do for a good reception, Edward joked. At my expense, Daniel growled. My husband isn't as annoyed as he pretends, Edith interjected with a conspiratorial smile.
It's far cheaper than rebuilding the cottage.
And you must admit my mother's receptions are splendid. And let's not forget that my wife likes having her sisters nearby, Daniel added, resigned and proud at the same time. Will Judith be there? Edward asked, blushing. Of course, Edith replied, though she noticed the hesitation. Something has changed, she thought, but decided not to press the question. The walk filled her with energy. By the time they arrived, several guests were already there. The usual crowd, Daniel murmured as Letitia took his cane, hats and gloves. I'll keep the shawl, Edith said. In case it turns cool. My dear, Lady Agatha exclaimed, swooping down on them. Don't tell me you allowed her to walk all the way here, Your Grace? Daniel accepted the scolding with good humor. He had learned that his mother-in-law pronounced his title aloud when she wanted an audience.
You know how stubborn she can be, he replied.
Judith and Dorothy embraced Edith enthusiastically, despite their mother's critical look. They always disobeyed her in that. They greeted Daniel and Edward. Judith withdrew her hand quickly and moved away. Edith exchanged an inquiring glance with her husband, but Lady Agatha ushered them to the table before they could ask anything. The dinner was a success. No one mentioned Edith's pregnancy outright, though everyone asked about her health. Later, the men withdrew to the library, while the women discussed the birth of Princess Alexandrina Victoria, and the rumors about the regent's wife. Edith imagined Daniel debating enthusiastically about new continental methods. Always looking forward, she thought fondly. Near midnight, the guests took their leave. Edith's back protested. I can't wait to breathe some fresh air, she said. They walked slowly hand in hand. When the house came into view, Edith stopped, drew a deep breath and lifted her eyes to the sky.
What a night oh.
Daniel understood at once. Without hesitation, he swept her into his arms. I can do this, he thought, surprised and grateful for his own body.
Call Mrs. Fitzallen, he shouted to Edward.
For Edith, being carried like that was a silent confirmation of her husband's restored health and of the life that was about to begin. Shortly before dawn, Daniel paced back and forth outside the door where the midwife had ordered him to wait. He knew with relief that the worst was over. Edward had not left his side all night. If I'm left alone with my thoughts, I'll sink, he had told himself. They had spoken of trivialities, avoiding the brandy, until the radiant Mrs. Fitzallen announced that the child had been born and Edith was safe. The door opened. Peggy Hawthorne appeared exactly as Daniel had imagined her, round, rosy, and in complete command of the situation. Come in, Your Grace. The boy is doing splendidly, and wants to meet his father. Daniel crossed the threshold with a slight limp. Edith lay propped among pillows. Her smile gave him courage. He won't notice the eye, he reminded himself, he's just a baby. When he saw the child in her arms, all fear fell away.
He's a beautiful boy, he said.
Look at that dark hair. Like yours, Edith replied. Like what I once had, he corrected, with a trace of nostalgia. The baby opened his eyes and smiled. Daniel caught his breath. Hello, Whitcombe, Daniel Ashcroft, he whispered. I'm your father. He still wore a small bandage on his nose and another on his eyelid, more for her sake than his, but he did not regret the operation. Tagliacozzi's words were true, not to please the eye, but to comfort the spirit. Thank you, he said to Edith, kissing her forehead. I love you, she replied. A small hand touched his chin. Daniel lowered his gaze to those trusting green eyes. I love you both, he whispered. And for the first time in a long while, the future did not frighten him. Enough light. That quiet night, Edith thought that life did not move in a straight line but in layers. As if each year lifted a veil, not to reveal a final truth, but to allow something to heal a little more. No grand revelations, only that almost imperceptible relief that comes when pain no longer takes up all the space. Daniel slept beside her. His breathing was deeper than it had once been, more trusting. The tired eye, that one which for so long had seemed to lag behind, now rested without tension, less burdened by the weight of memory. She knew it was not a sudden miracle, but the result of constancy, of hands, of patience, of the certainty that the body listens to when it is treated with respect. I haven't changed you, she thought with steady tenderness. I've only walked you back to yourself. Together they had learned something essential, Love does not wait for one to be complete. It does not demand arrival at any prior place. It comes when it comes and it stays. It does not retreat from cracks nor from what still hurts. It inhabits them. She thought then of Judith. Of how simple her bond with Edward had always been, a quiet attraction without display, made of glances that hurried nothing. For years they had waited without knowing it, and now at last they were promised. Not because the world approved, though now it did, but because time had ripened what was already true. Judith, finally accepted without conditions, had not changed her essence, she had simply stopped doubting it. Edith smiled. There are loves that do not conquer, they endure. That year had closed more things than she could name. Old fears. Inherited expectations. Silences that were no longer necessary. Not everything was resolved, and perhaps never would be entirely, but she had learned not to confuse healing with perfection. Healing was many times simply choosing not to harden. She remembered a story someone had once told her, a destroyed temple, total darkness, barely a remnant of oil. And yet, the decision to light the lamp. Not because it was enough, but because it was all there was. That is living, she thought. Lighting the light with what remains. And trusting. The light did not promise to dispel every shadow, but it offered warmth, truth, presence. Without it there was no life. With it, even the longest night could be inhabited. Edith closed her eyes and let the thought settle. She felt grateful for those who had walked close, for those who had stayed, for those who had known when to leave. Everything had counted. Everything had left a mark. We take nothing with us, she thought without sadness. Only what we have loved, what we have cared for, the truth we dared to live. She leaned toward Daniel, and rested her hand on his chest, feeling the steady rhythm beneath her fingers. In that simple gesture was everything, the past that had not defeated them, the future that did not need to be mastered, the present made sufficient. And in silence, a full, devoted silence, she formed a wish that was not hers alone, that the inner light, that fragile and stubborn spark, would remain alive, that whatever was ready to heal would do so gently, that they would know how to care for one another, that love, even when it hurt, would never cease to hold them. Because everyone, she knew now, carried a quiet pain. And also, though they sometimes forgot, the capacity to light the flame with whatever little there was. And that, Edith thought as sleep reached her, was enough. The end. Author's note. There are stories that are born when one world is fading, and another has not yet learned how to name itself. For years I have written about medieval romance, about Scotland and its borders, lands where war, faith and myth coexisted without asking permission. This novel, by contrast, led me toward a different and tempting challenge, the English Regency, a time that appears orderly, elegant, civilized, yet is profoundly marked by what has just been broken. The summer of 1815, after Waterloo, is not merely a historical date. It is a threshold. Europe awakens from an endless war and tries to rebuild itself with what remains: wounded bodies, hierarchies that resist collapse, old certainties that no longer suffice. I did not want to write a Napoleonic novel, but an intimate post-war story, where the most decisive battle is not fought on the field, but within those who return. Daniel belongs to that old world: honor, endurance, silence. Edith, by contrast, embodies something new and still uncomfortable, a different way of understanding the body, healing, and love itself. Between them there is no violent rupture, but a difficult dialogue between what has been inherited and what is beginning to be born. As I wrote, I thought often about how transitional eras demand a price. Letting go of what was, even when it gave us identity, hurts. Yet that loss, when crossed with honesty, can become sacred. Not because everything is resolved, but because something true begins to emerge. This story does not aim to be a medical treatise, or an exhaustive reconstruction of the Regency. Above all, it is a novel about healing as an act of love, healing not to erase the marks but to learn to inhabit them without shame, loving not when the other is whole, but when they are still tired, uncertain, in process. Perhaps that is why this period drew me so strongly. Because the Regency is not only balls and drawing rooms, It is the attempt, sometimes clumsy, sometimes luminous, to build a new world from the remnants of the old one. And because in the end, every true love story resembles that. With gratitude, Naerya, Lirienmoor.